If you don't have a seat yet, I encourage you to find one. Welcome, welcome. If you're new to Wellspring, this is Wellspring. We are the place where all are welcome, all are accepted, all are loved, and all always means all. So welcome to Wellspring. I'm Jessica Peterson. I'm the associate pastor. We're so excited to be hosting this event. If you're new here, we want you to know where the bathrooms are because you might need them. So out this way and to the right, there's women's and then men's restrooms that direction. In the nursery, there's also a gender-neutral restroom if you need that. So feel free to go into this wood door over here, and you can use that restroom. And Jeff is here. He's going to introduce John, right? I said everything I'm supposed to say, right?
That's it. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you for being here and for honoring us. I first want to say a big word of thanks to the Methodist Federation for Social Action. So many people who have been a big part of this are part of MFSA, and Milton's kind of hanging out at the back, but those who are members of our MFSA, will you raise your hand? Because we have several here. So this is a lot of the Methodist Federation for Social Action, and their work has truly been instrumental. And it's been a pleasure for us here at Wellspring to be able to partner with MFSA in the ways that we do, because our missions truly do align, as do many of those churches that are remaining United Methodist are seeking more and more this same kind of alignment. And so we're very blessed by this collaboration. And I will tell you, I first met John in 2019. We had gone through a terrible general conference. And for those who know remember that many of your clergy were very crestfallen, right? We were heartbroken over the way that general conference went. And so I met John thanks to Sid Hall. Sid and I had been acquainted, and we are so Wellspring is one of two reconciling congregations, both in the southern part of our conference. So we are at the border, obviously, with the Rio, Texas annual conference. And so I called Sid and I said, I'm really feeling like I'm just overwhelmed, and I need to know where my tribe is meeting. And he said, your tribe is meeting on Mondays at 1 o'clock at University Church. Be there. And so I started driving in to University every Monday, and I got there. I wanted to be there before it started, and I stayed there till after it was all finished. And John and his team were most instrumental in welcoming me and helping me see that I had a place. And John's ministry, as you know, has been a ministry of radical inclusiveness. His ministry is one that has touched hundreds, thousands of lives. He is a person who has really been influential in my life and ministry. So John, your message, your openness, your welcoming message, the way that you have been a pastor has truly influenced me. And then John's book has come out, and if you have not already read it, you will want to read it. I'm sure we're selling out very soon back there, but he brought books, and he will. I've already made sure he's going to stick around and sign books too. So, but John is someone who has this incredible message about our racial past as Methodist. And the historical research he did and has done for us is powerful. And so, John, we welcome you, and we are so glad to have you with us today. We look forward to hearing from you.
Can I just have you along anytime I'm doing presentations, Jeff? And you can just this is Jeff, he's my introducer. I love it. You all also sit like folks do at University Church. Most of the people, the whole sanctuary at University Church just like tilts to the left. You know, if it was actually weighted down, it would just would kind of go under. So, well, thanks for having me today, and thanks for coming out on a Sunday afternoon, a million other things that you could do. It's almost pretty enough to walk or do something outside. It's getting close, right? You can feel it in the air. So I'm going to talk about the book and kind of talk around the book. I'm going to try not to read the book to you. You know, when you go to book signings, you get the book read to you, right? I'm not going to do that too much. But this is work that I've been doing over the past couple of years, and I retired 2 years ago. And before I was out the door, people were asking me, what are you going to do when you retire? And if you're close to retiring, make sure you have at least some kind of answer. Jessica, when you get there in about 40 years or whenever, think of something, because people just sort of filled in the blank. You know, you should do this, you should do that. And everybody was saying, well, you ought to write a book. And about what? And they said, oh, you should just write a book about your sermons. And I thought, slide 2, okay, I'm pretty sure the world does not need another book of sermons by an old white guy. So in the spring of 2021, we had for the past almost 10 years, I guess, we've had a racial justice group meeting at University Church. And we did lots of reading and studies together. And so I've been reading this book by Robert P. Jones. Anybody familiar with him? He goes by Robbie Jones. Yeah, so he's the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute. He's a religious commentator. He has a Substack that he does. And he's just written a new book called The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy that I'm about halfway through, and it's also really good. And you can catch some of his videos. Sorry, I'm just skipping on here. So this first book, White Too Long, and I think is there a slide on that? Yeah. The subtitle of the book is really what grabbed me. The subtitle is The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. So it's 2021, right? And we'll get there in a second. It's just a picture of the book. It's not anything really spectacular. So I had, let's see. Yeah, that's not in my slide presentation, I don't think. Yeah. Okay. Here we go. There you go. Okay. Yay. Notice carefully the imagery in the book. Does that bring anything to mind? I mean, yeah, it's like the peaked hats of the Klan, right? Yeah. So when I saw that book and I saw that cover, I thought, and it's 2021, and I'm watching with you the rise of Christian nationalism and this brazen openness of racist and white supremacist talk in our country. I guess we thought it was gone, and then it came back with a fury. And I thought that's what the book was going to be about. White supremacy in those far-right churches. Next slide. And I thought, amen, Brother Jones, you go get 'em. The next slide is a picture of Klan members gathering outside a church. Yeah, probably from the 1920s. Well, I was wrong. On page 6, he writes this on the slide. I'll read it to you. White Christian churches have not just been complacent. They've not only been complicit, rather, as the dominant cultural power in America, they have been responsible for constructing and sustaining a project to protect white supremacy and resist black equality. This project has framed the entire American story. Note the subject there. This is not the South, right? This is not a political party. He's talking about white Christian churches, which I believe would include the Methodist Church. And by white supremacy, he doesn't mean the Klan, and he's not talking about skinheads. I mean, that's part of it, but he means this fundamental belief that white people are more valued than others, a belief that still pervades our culture today, right? Jones was raised in the church in Jackson, Mississippi. He describes himself as a 5-time-a-week Baptist. I was trying to figure that out. That's Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night, Bible study. I don't know. That's a lot. Yeah, Southern Baptist. So he talks a lot about the Baptist church because a big part of that first book is Jones coming to terms with his own racial history in the church. But it's not long into the book before he talks about Methodists, our struggles with slavery, our division over slavery in 1844, then our reunion in 1939 where we segregated black Methodists into their own jurisdiction. And we created what was essentially a Jim Crow church. and then our continuing resistance to accepting the equality of black persons. So you don't have to peel back the layers very far to uncover racism, white supremacy, segregation littered throughout our past. And it's from before the founding of the church, and it runs all the way up to the present day. We haven't just been silent bystanders, just kind of watching all these things happen. We have actually stoked the fires of white supremacy, and we've kept them going for the next generation. By we, I mean white American Methodists. And this is especially problematic because we're a church, right? We're a church. For goodness sake, we're supposed to be a moral voice in the community. And instead of that, we're throwing holy water and blessing the status quo of injustice and inequality in our history. I think, and I added this to the presentation because I was thinking about this, and this is something that I thought more about when I was first writing the book. I think it's also critical for us as Methodists to face down our own hypocrisy. And there's different levels of it. How many of us have complained or even written letters to the State Board of Education, maybe to our legislators, spoken at meetings maybe, about the way our Texas history books evade real talk about the horrors of slavery or Jim Crow or the legacy of white supremacy in our country? You've read some of these things about what they have in the history books now, right? And yet, how many of our Methodist history books that we use in our Methodism 101 classes, how many of them talk about racism and white supremacy in the church? Okay, I know. I've taught these classes. Have you taught Methodist? Yeah, 101 classes. I know how many. Yeah, I've taught them for 30 years. 0. They don't talk about it. So if we're going to stand up in public and call for the state to be accountable to the truth of our history, then we need to be willing to hold our churches accountable also, I think. And we must be willing to do not only that work of actually reading and teaching and learning this history, but also lamenting it and confessing it. Because it's not just out there somewhere, it's in here. And it's still in here with us. And so facing that hypocrisy, that was one of the key driving forces in my writing this book. Well, I set Joan's book down as I read it several times to allow all of this to sink in. And maybe you did that when you were reading my book. You were kind of reading through it and you're like, this is ridiculous. I mean, I can't tell you. I had a friend who said that they would read one chapter and then just set it aside for 3 days. Throughout our glorious Methodist history, all the time we're creating these new churches and we're building schools and we're supporting missions, and we were supporting racism. Indeed we were. And Robbie Jones and others pile on story after story and statistic after statistic. We were carriers of the virus of white supremacy. Next slide. Well, this is probably not the best news to get right now, right in the middle of all that we're in as Methodists, as we're watching the church sort of calve into like an iceberg. But at some point, it's something we have to reckon with. It's a scandalous history. Do we still believe, even though I know that most churches don't use a confession of sin at the beginning of worship services like we used to, I think we still believe in that, right? We still believe in the confession of sin as the path to new life. We have to face our past. We have to acknowledge what we've done. We've left undone those things which we ought to have done, and we've done those things which we ought not to have done. And there is, come on, help me out. Excellent. Cradle Methodist back there. Yeah, so those are those first steps on the journey toward dismantling racism. So that's where my retirement project started. With Joan's book, it was like an altar call for me. I thought, I need to dig into this. And I discovered that very quickly nobody really, other than folks in the academy, had written much. There were a few books. I put a few of them up here that I used, and they're in the back. They're excellent. They're probably, I don't know what that, yeah, right there. Just on different topics. A lot of them are PhD dissertations that were rewritten into books and sold as books, which are great, but they're pretty scholarly, pretty academic. But none of these books focused on the entire span from Wesley to the present day, and many of the books didn't really focus on Methodist history. So I thought, maybe I need to write something about this. So I'll just write this little curriculum thingy, maybe 60 pages, and and I'll just pass it out and let the Sunday school classes use it. And then I started reading and finding stuff and finding articles. And I wrote the first chapter about John Wesley, and it was already like 20 pages. And so, and every week I would scratch my head and I would tilt back in my chair and I would say, you have got to be kidding. You've got to be kidding. This happened? We did this. The brand spanking new Methodist Church, right out of the gate, took off in the footsteps of its founder, right? John Wesley, those of you that have read the book, you know this. We had strong anti-slavery ideals. 6 months into our new life, those strong anti-slavery rules were suspended. I learned that Thomas Koch, next slide, he helped craft some really strong anti-slavery rules. He was preaching in a barn one day in Virginia, and he was threatened by a mob, and a fashionably dressed woman left the meeting, went outside, and offered 50 rioters a large reward if the mob would administer 100 lashes to Dr. Koch for his anti-slavery stance. Somehow, by the grace of God, Koch managed to escape. He lived to preach another day, but guess what? He changed his message, right? It wasn't as strong and as forceful as it had been. So over time, I'm collecting these stories, and I'm beginning to see a book take shape, something for pastors, something for lay people, would allow us to face our past, acknowledge our past, but it was all so dark and grim. And I went to talk to Linda. I said, this is what I have. I said, nobody's going to want to buy this book. It's awful. Who's going to want to read this book? Who's going to want to teach this book to a Sunday school class? Don't we have enough bad things to think about on a daily basis, right? So, but as I kept reading, and there's a James Baldwin quote that I just sort of inserted here, and I haven't figured out where it goes in the presentation yet, but anyway, just hold on to that thought about what to do with all the bad stories. This is a great quote from James Baldwin, and I think he expresses it better than I do about why we need to do this work. All that can save you now is your confrontation with your own history, which is not your past, but your present. Your history has led you to this moment, and you can only begin to change yourself by looking at what you are doing in the name of your history. There's a real freedom that comes, I hope, I think, from facing this history down and then committing to say, you know what, we're going to repair this. We haven't told the whole truth, and we're going to repair that in the future. And maybe there's some healing too. Okay, so back to the dilemma. How do I tell this awful story of our failures as a church, and who's going to read it? Fortunately, I found that alongside the river of racism and white supremacy, I pictured it as this giant frothing river after a flood, just sort of carrying everything with it. And all of us are swimming in it and trying to navigate it. There was another stream, a small but mighty stream of white American Methodists who were working from 1784 to the present day, fighting for black equality and determined to dismantle racism. So slide 14. And I know I keep slide 15. Yeah, that's just a shameless plug for my... Okay, let's stop there. Maybe I guess I missed that slide. Okay, we'll stop there. I say white American Methodists a lot, and I hope you understand that. As a white pastor, I understand that this is what my black friends would call white people work. This is work that we need to do. Our black siblings in the church did not create white supremacy. We did. And so we need to work on it. And we need to stop asking them to guide us. And if they want to help out, that's great. And they can hold us accountable in our work. And one of the agencies in our church, the General Commission on Religion and Race, which started in 1968 with the Union of the Churches, they're actually working with me to come up with a curriculum because they feel like this history is something that the church needs to know before General Conference, which I think is really cool. I couldn't believe it. I said, "Did you read the book?" And Elaine, who I was working with, she said, "Of course I read the book. I read all kinds of books." And she held it up, the book like this, and she's waving the book at me on the Zoom call, and it has all these little notes and things in it. And I said, "Well, why do you want to do this book?" And she said, "Because you're a white Methodist pastor. You're talking to white lay people, white pastors, and that's not happening enough in the church." Okay? So there's these two streams, and would that we could be so much more swimming in the stream of justice and mercy and peace. And so what I found myself doing was that I would report on all the awful things that we did, but I also would, in the interest also of telling the whole story, talk about some of these high points, right? Or the people who were maybe witnesses to a different path, or sort of beacons of light in these times. So, in my book, I write about John Wesley, as I said, his deepest aversion to slavery. Did you know John Wesley wrote a tract that was published throughout England, the colonies, and I talk a lot about it in chapter 2. It's called Thoughts Upon Slavery, and I think that's it right there. Yeah. He actually cribbed a lot of it from a Quaker anti-racist, but doing that back then was okay. It wasn't called plagiarism, and it was like the Quaker, had letters going back and forth, and the Quaker person, his name was Benezet, said, "I'm so glad that you're using all this material from my book." And there's just like all these massive, there's pages after pages, but a lot of it is John Wesley stuff. And he's writing against what he called, against slavery and the slave trade, the vilest that ever saw the sun. And that's his description of it in America. The last letter that Wesley penned days before he died was, on the slide here, it was to William Wilberforce, of all things. And Wilberforce was a member of Parliament who was instrumental in abolishing the trade in enslaved persons. And can you all read that? I'll just leave it up there for a second. Do you want me to read it? Can you see it at the back? Okay. Unless God has raised you up, and this is the whole letter, short letter. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. That is so Wesley, isn't it? But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it. So he's around 87 years old at that time, writing this letter. William Wilberforce. Wilberforce is a member of the British Parliament, and he was working to abolish the trade in enslaved people. Yeah, Wilberforce. So I write about Wesley, right? Some positive things, but I also write about George Whitefield, slide, who began as a Methodist. He became one of the most powerful and moving preachers in the First Great Awakening. There's an interesting anecdote that I didn't put in there about Ben Franklin, who went to hear George Whitefield speak. Whitefield came over to the United States and spoke up and down the coast and all over the place. And Ben Franklin had heard about him and thought, this guy can't be that good. I mean, come on. He thought he was just getting a lot of publicity. And Franklin sat in the crowd, and I guess Wilberforce, they didn't have any PA back then, so Wilberforce must have had this enormous voice to project over thousands of people who were out there in this field, you know. I'm sorry, I'm saying Wilberforce, I mean Whitefield, George Whitefield. Ben Franklin was so moved that he actually, when the offering plates went around, that he actually ended up dipping into his pocket and putting some money on the offering plate. So he was a prime mover in the First Great Awakening, but he also was a prime mover in opening Georgia to slavery. And he even enslaved people for his mission in Bethesda, a children's mission. He justified it by arguing in his letters that these precious humans were better off in Georgia enslaved than they were in Africa free. Yeah. It sounds like what?
Florida.
Sounds like Florida. I saw a meme the other day that said, you think that you have it bad. Some people actually are living in Florida right now. Well, I have no evidence to prove this, but I wonder if part of the inspiration for the book by Wesley that we just saw, Thoughts Upon Slavery, was Whitefield. You know, they argued about a lot of things back and forth, and some of those things were theological. But many of the things that Whitefield said in his letters in support of enslaving people, those were the very arguments that Wesley lampooned in Thoughts Upon Slavery. I don't think that's coincidental. I don't know that anybody's established that connection there. But one of them was the argument that was common at that time, that white Europeans couldn't work outside in the southern climate. I mean, come on. And Wesley writes, Our family lived there. We worked outside in Georgia for the 2 years that we were there. We were fine. Okay, so I have to write about pro-slavery Methodists who pushed back against abolitionists and twisted Scripture to defend slavery. So here we are in this slide. I don't think that I'm not sure if this person was Methodist or not, but you get the idea from the title. All of these tracts were going around at this time, and Southern Slavery in the Bible, a vindication of Southern slavery from the Old and New Testaments. And that's a problem, isn't it? I mean, when you look at our scriptures, there's a whole lot more that seems favorable to enslaving people than against enslaving people. Yeah, it's tough. Anson West, in his History of Methodism, I quote this in my book, he records this bizarre interchange between a missionary and a person in bondage. And so there's the book there, History of Methodism in Alabama. The missionary asked, "What did God make you for?" The enslaved person answered, "To make a crop." The missionary asked, "What is the meaning of thou shalt not commit adultery?" The enslaved person answered, "To serve our heavenly Father, our earthly master, our overseer, and not steal anything." This was a Methodist catechism for enslaved peoples. I mean, it adds to me a whole new and ugly wrinkle to all of the stories that we've read about all of the Methodist missions, these compassionate missions in the South to those who were enslaved. It wasn't just education, friends. It was indoctrination. So I write about that. I also write about that small minority of people, the abolitionists. I don't know, those of you who read the book, did you notice any parallels with anything today? Back in the 1830s and 1840s, you had this very small group of people who were abolitionists, right? And then you had a pretty large group, mostly gathered in the South, but really a lot of them all over the country who were in support of slavery. And then you had this group in the middle who kind of called themselves conservatives. And they were on the fence about this, or they were hoping that somebody would do something someday about this. Does that ring a bell at all with anything else that, yeah, it does, right? Isn't that amazing? I mean, that's like almost 200 years ago, and it's the same pattern repeating itself. Yeah. So one of the myths that we grow up with is maybe that Methodists were abolitionists back in the 1830s and 40s, and I'm laughing because it's just laughable. I mean, the Methodists who were abolitionists left the church in 1843 to form the Wesleyan connection. So Orange Scott, and he was one of the ones who left eventually. He was a Methodist pastor. He was a presiding elder in Vermont. We call them district superintendents today. His picture is there in slide 20. He was a gift to the abolitionist movement. In a short time on the public scene, Scott unleashed a veritable torrent against the evils of slavery and anti-slavery and enslavers. His rhetoric was so passionate and so strong that he often found himself having to apologize after a meeting or after a debate for insulting this or that person. And he was constantly in trouble and constantly like that far away from being brought up on charges. Orange Scott. So in my book, you'll hear about the Klan a little bit and its infiltration of the Methodist Church. There are kind of three iterations of the Klan. And the first one is the one that's formed right after the Civil War up till 1871, until it was banned. And it was extremely violent. I mean, the violence in that period of time, from 1865 to 71, it was like the war had not stopped. It was just unrelenting. Well, in 1915, a former Methodist, he wasn't exactly a pastor. We would have called him like maybe a lay preacher, William Simmons. He thought it would be a great thing to rejuvenate the Klan. And there was a movie around that time. Any of you remember that? I mean, I know none of you lived back in 1915, but The Birth of the Nation, yeah. So it came out then, yeah. And so that's kicked off this Klan that went from 1915 until late 1920s, some places into the 1930s. And then we have the Klan today that's just this whole mess and mirage of all kinds of groups. You'll learn, I have to talk about the horrors of lynching, racial massacres. Slide 22, I've got the Tulsa Massacre, one of the worst. The Methodist response to all of this stuff, what do you guess it was? Ostriches, yeah. Put their head in the ground, they didn't say anything. Crickets, yeah. Or blame the victim, say it was really their fault. I mean, that's what the Methodist bishop who came in the week after the Tulsa massacre, Bishop Muzan, he basically blamed the black people in what we call Black Wall Street. Or they just looked the other way. That didn't happen. Many of these things, of these incidents, if you went to school in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, in those periods, you would not have heard anything about any of this stuff, not even in college courses probably. And it wasn't until the 90s that some of this stuff started to come out as there were local recognitions about it. I think it was the 90s with the Tulsa massacre. So I'm going to tell you some of those awful stories. I apologize for that. But also I'm going to tell you the stories of some incredible folks who are willing to stand up against this tide of racism in the early 20th century. Do you know who they were? Any ideas? Some of them might even be here. Was that louder? The women! The Methodist women. Hallelujah. They were thanks to God, yes, the Methodist women. So there we go. United Women in Faith now, right? How many of you here, did anybody here go to Southwestern or teach at Southwestern? Yeah, okay, so great. So do you remember there's a yearly lectureship that's called the Jessie Daniel Ames Lecture in Feminist Studies? Anybody know who Jessie Daniel Ames was? You know who she was. Did you know her? No? Okay. Well, she lived into the 80s, didn't she? Yeah, but she lived way out she had moved out to the East Coast by then. Yeah. Apparently she was a real character. I mean, there's a couple people at First Church in Austin that knew her and said that she was really real interesting person to be around. Well, her name ought to be a household word in Central Texas. She grew up in this area, right? And cut her teeth in the temperance movement, in the suffragist movements, and then 1930, along with 11 other women. And this was at the behest of several black Methodist women who challenged white women at a conference to step up. One speaker said, if white women took it upon themselves to end lynching, it would end. It would be over with. And Jessie Daniel Ames and others heard that. And so they used, it was mostly Methodist, but it involved other churches, but they used the organization of the Methodist women to infiltrate, right? Really. I mean, isn't that perfect in a way? Because who are the Methodist women? I mean, I know as a pastor, right? You all are totally independent. I was reminded of that every year as a pastor, right? I have no control over the Methodist women. And then they would hand me their budget, right, for the year and say, this is our budget and how we spend our money. And I said, wait a second, isn't this in our budget? And it was like, no. This is our budget. And then what's the main thing that Methodist women do? One of the main things that they do. Support women, children, and families. But also when you gather for circles and things, what are you often doing together? Education, right? You bring food, yeah. But you're doing this education, right? And so imagine in the 1920s, as all of this social justice stuff is kicking up, who are the Methodist women reading? They're reading that stuff, and they're getting inspired by that stuff. And so she organized this group, the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, and harnessed their power. They investigated lynchings. They got pledges from officials against lynching. They argued with sensationalist newspapers who wanted to tell a certain story about lynchings, and they wanted to say, no, that's not the story. And they even engaged in direct confrontation, which I can't really imagine. Can you imagine showing up at a courthouse back in the 1930s, dressed in your Sunday finest, maybe with a couple of other women, and telling all of the men who are in front of the courthouse, probably with guns, to go home? Yeah, these were some brave, brave souls. And historians who have studied their work and have studied what went on in different communities say that they contributed significantly to the end of the horrific tragedy of lynching. Jessie Daniel Ames was not a perfect person. I don't know that anybody who does the social justice walk is perfect. But she was a powerhouse. And one of the key things is that this movement was inspired by basically her black sisters who said, this is something that you need to do. And so there's another whole part of this book that's been written by a few historians, I guess, but maybe needs to be updated, and that is the history of what black Methodists were doing, right? Because who was doing all the civil rights work, and who was doing all the fighting, and who was doing the real work in these periods? And I touch on it occasionally in the book. It was black Methodists. It wasn't the white Methodists, right? So just, be clear on that. Okay, so I had some you've got to be kidding moments with, there were two Methodists from this era, and so let's skip on to the next slide. I think you'll get who this guy is. Who is he? George Wallace, yeah, governor of Alabama. Well, Wallace was a Methodist. Yeah, really? You have got to be kidding. Yeah. Well, we're open and welcoming, right? We're going to take everybody in, I guess, even racists. So he was elected as a delegate from Alabama to the 1968 Uniting Conference in Dallas. Okay, so, just like we do, they elected delegates to go to that conference. And that was the union between what was the United Methodist Church at that point, although it wasn't called that, just the Methodist Church, but North and South, and then the EUB Church, the Evangelical United Brethren Church. I really think that his election as delegate was, if you will pardon the expression, the Alabama Methodist equivalent of the middle finger to the movement to integrate our church. I did not put that in my book, okay? And then this next guy, I could not even believe this, but anybody, any ideas? Good, yeah. I put the second piece in there with the fire hoses. Dear brother Theophilus Eugene Connor. Doesn't Theophilus mean something like lover of God? That was his first name. Public Safety Commissioner in Birmingham, Alabama. Staunch member of, next slide, Woodlawn Methodist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. John Rutland was the pastor there, and I've met some folks who knew John Rutland. He was the pastor there in the 50s and 60s. And when he preached, he sometimes preached on racial inclusion in Birmingham, Alabama, in a Methodist church. And when he preached on racial inclusion, he had to endure profane harangues in the worship service from the man who was racial bigotry personified. Methodist layperson Bull Connor would get up during worship and would lay it on him. So this is I think this is an important story for a couple of reasons, but one is that this is one of the many exceptions to that myth that if you were in a church in the South, you couldn't speak out. So I when I was early on in the presentations, I would take this to some Sunday school classes and to groups of people and all that, and they would say things like, well, that's just the way things were back then. And I'm like, no, not everybody was bought into racism and segregation and all those things, no. Or they would say, well, if you were in a church in the South, goodness, you couldn't speak out, you would lose your job. Well, yeah, in some churches you would. You had to move. And in the book, you'll read about some folks. But there were places where you could speak out. You learned how to say it, and they knew what you were talking about. But and you identified yourself as a maybe an integrationist or something along those lines. But that was not true that there was just this. So I'll give you another example too that's not in the book. So one of the neat things that I got to do. How am I running on time? Who's timekeeping? Are you okay? A few more minutes? Okay. So one of the cool things that I got to do is, when we get into the civil rights period, I talk about this guy, Ed King. I got really confused when I was reading the book because it would talk about Dr. King, and of course I immediately think of Martin Luther King. Well, no, this was Ed King, who was the chaplain at Tougaloo College in the 1960s in Jackson, Mississippi. Okay, Tougaloo College, all-black college, Ed King, white pastor. Ed King organized, and I do talk about this in the book, organized these interracial groups to try to desegregate these churches in Jackson, Mississippi. So they would show up at the door of the church and they would just ask to go into worship. They were met by literally a phalanx of ushers who stood shoulder to shoulder with their arms crossed like that the black suits and the white ties and all older white men, and wouldn't let them into church. Linda and I got a chance to drive to Jackson, Mississippi, and I got a chance to have a day with Ed King. I mean, he was in good spirits and good health that day. He even took us down to the Civil Rights Museum and showed us around there. His picture's all over the place in there. And we went also with a friend who was there who taught during the 60s at Millsaps College. And they went to Galloway Methodist Church. This professor at Millsaps College back then had gone to Galloway Methodist Church, which is right downtown Mississippi across from the State House. And I asked him, do you remember his name? It was like TL or something like that, TL. I said, TL, was everybody in the church against having black people worship in the church? And he said, oh, no. He said, it was a strong group of people, but not everybody was like that. He said, I'll tell you, one Sunday I remember, there was one of my friends was asked to be an usher. One of the group of ushers went up and asked him, said, would you mind ushering today? And so he said, yeah, sure, I'll go out and usher. So he's standing out there at one of the doors, and they have all these, about 8 doors across the front, and he's at one door, and this black couple walks up with their kids, and they say, well, we'd like to worship here. And he says, come on right in. And he leads them in, and he said, and you can sit right here with my wife and my family in the worship service. And I said, what happened to him? And he said, well, he's a respected member of the community, and nothing happened to him. So it was porous. It was a porous system. When you read about it, you think that it was just like all the doors were closed. So, okay. I want to share just a couple more things, and I won't read all of this to you, but I think the next slide is, let's keep going one more. Yeah, so I want to talk about this bunch of characters. Do you know any people that are in this organization? I don't know. It's a bunch of communists, I think, isn't it? You know that people were accused of communism, right? People who were in the MFSA in the 1950s were accused of being communist Reds. Well, the MFSA, because there was so much pushback against integration, especially after Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, there was just this huge pushback, and Methodists began to push back and organize against anybody who was perceived as liberal in the church. Okay, so they pushed back against the MFSA. The FBI decided to do an inquiry into the MFSA and called MFSA leader to come to speak to the House on Un-American Activities Committee. This is in the 1950s. Yeah, I'd have to look the date up in here, but yeah, kind of mid-50s. Yeah. So so here's the poor soul who. So next slide. Yeah, was his name James McMichael? Anyway, so he is he is before the House on the HUAC to defend the Methodist Church and MFSA, and I think they also were inquiring about the Epworth League, which had actually disbanded about 6 years before, but somehow the FBI didn't notice that, I guess. And I love this picture of McMichael because above the table, he looks very calm, and he's just like presenting like this, and it looks like he has a Bible there. But underneath the table, look at his legs; they're all twisted up like he's like, "Oh my God, I am in front of the FBI in this committee." And well, and of course they kept him under surveillance for years after this. McMichael had a beautiful reply that I'll show you, or I'll just read to you real quick in case you've forgotten it. So he's in front of the committee, Jack McMichael, and somebody says, and of course, as a good pastor, he's talking about Jesus. We talk about Jesus, right, now and again. And an exasperated committee member said, could you leave Jesus out of the discussion? And McMichael replied that he could not, and that in a situation like this, where guilt by association seems to be the principle on which you are operating, I am sure Jesus himself would long ago have been hauled before this committee. I love it. So that's in your history. And the MFSA went into sort of a dive at that time, and people were not really joining, and it kind of revived later on in the 60s. I'm not sure how strong it is now, but I do wonder, we're entering a new era as a church, right? I mean, we don't know what the years ahead hold for us. And many of us, we're not going to be around for 20, 25, 30 years to see what this new church looks like. We're going to be streamlined. We're going to be a smaller but mightier group, right? But I just wonder whether the MFSA could have a fuller role in making certain, for one thing, that this fight to dismantle racism, that it doesn't get pushed off into like a special projects group or something, but that simply becomes part of what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, that we dismantle racism and that we stand for equality for all persons. Amen? Yeah. And I'm going to share one more thing with you. So there's several things that I hope for in writing this book. I do wonder if maybe it will encourage some folks. I mean, I hope for one thing that, if folks read this, maybe they'll just sort of get the idea that, gosh, this is a problem, and maybe we should do something about this. So I hope that maybe it will energize some folks, because white people, sadly, we think that we don't have to do anything about racism. We really think that. And in fact, racism hurts all of us, right? It hurts all of us. And one of my black friends says, she says, I know it sounds bizarre to me, but she says, you need to keep telling white people that racism is hurting them too, and white supremacy is hurting them too. So I think that's important. But I also wonder if people might be looking at their church, at their past, at their roots, at what were we like, and why are we here in this part of town, and what were we like back in the 50s and 60s, and how open have we been, and all of that. And I came across an example, and I thought I would share that with you all, just because the name of this church is Wellspring United Methodist Church, and it's in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. Did you know that you have a sibling church up there in Shrewsbury? Do you know about this story? No?
But, domain names.
Okay. So the church closed in 2020, okay? And various items, historical items, and all sorts of things were given to the DS, Megan Stowe, and they were supposed to be put in the district archives. And somebody handed them over to the district superintendent and said, don't forget to look at the stuff that was in the cornerstone. And so she just puts all of the stuff away, and then at some point she thinks, oh, I wonder what was in the cornerstone. And the cornerstone was from the original church in 1927. And among the items were sort of the standard items, and we can go on to the next slide and keep going. There we go. Were standard items like there were newspapers, there were coins from the time. What would you expect in a cornerstone? Like, I don't know, church bulletins, membership records of the original members of the church. And there were some very troubling items in there. Show the next slide. There were pamphlets and magazines published by the Ku Klux Klan. They thought in 1927 that this is something that we would want future people in this church to know, that we were members of the Klan. Now, the Klan was different in the 1920s, I know that, and the Klan tried to pass itself off as a Protestant, just a Protestant group, an umbrella group of Protestants. But it still was hateful, and it was full of white supremacy, and it stood against Catholics and against immigrants, and there also was a kind of underground violent wing in the Klan at that time. So Stowe, like a good district superintendent that she was, took all of the materials and burned them. No, she didn't. She shared them with a bishop, and they began a discussion about, well, how do we respond to this? And the bishop said this, and I think it's the next slide. I thought this was wonderful. Fighting racism requires truth-telling, confession, and repentance from us all. We lift up this church's history not to shame them, because that's always kind of the thing, right? Oh, we're just going to shame people. We just want to make people feel bad. But as a lesson for all of us in the importance of facing the past and reconciling with it. We must start by understanding our past. That's the only way we can hope to create a present where there is true racial justice. Bishop Devidar. So assets from the sale of the church will create the In Our Time Fund, which will support anti-racism work in the New England Annual Conference and beyond. Things like grants and training and workshops to build leadership. Well, from my reading of things, and I go right up to 2020, I think that we're doing more stuff now than we've ever done as a church, anti-racism kind of stuff. I really do. I mean, within the church and outside the church. But I kind of feel like we can do more. I think we can do a lot more. And so my hope is, most of all, that this book will contribute to some of that work, which is facing the truth of our past, confessing who we are, and then beginning on that path toward racial justice. So by the grace of God, may that be so. Amen? Amen. Okay. That's concludes that part of my presentation. Yeah.
I'm Georgianne Hewitt. I'm a member of the Methodist Federation for Social Action, MFSA. Would all of our MFSA members stand up? All right. Thank you all for being here. First, I should say, if you would like to join us, we would love to have you join us. There's a great history here in Georgetown, and Milton's really good at telling that history. So at some point, I want to have him do that again. He's really good at talking about how that got started here in Georgetown. But just a little context, I was asked to make a comment or remark and start off the questions and facilitate you getting some of your questions answered. I, in addition to being a member of MFSA, came back here to Georgetown, and I'm a Southwestern graduate, Jesse Daniel Ames fan. Go Bucks. And I came back I'd worked for Southwestern for a long time, and I came back in 2015 after having done some studies on learning sciences and change management, and I had on my mind, how do we bring about major systemic change? And about that time, Dr. Ron Swain, who many of you know, Ron, raise your hand, was starting a group called Courageous Conversations along with other faith leaders. And that group was digging in, talking to the community, doing some amazing, courageous conversations. And then a few years later, after George Floyd was killed, Ron started a group at the Rotary Club of Georgetown, which started here in 1962, and we started having conversations about racial unity and peace building. And so I've been a member of that group, and then there's a wonderful group at First United Methodist Church here called the Micah Workers. Micah Workers, raise your hands, yes. So there's lots of people in this room who are doing lots of wonderful work, but I believe very much in God nudges, and all this week, some things have been on my mind as we were looking forward to having you here today. And I had written a post about a woman named Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a prison abolitionist. And I'd run across this quote where she said, "Where life is precious, life is precious." And so I just kind of shared that with some friends. And Michael Bartley, who's a chaplain at the Wesleyan, wrote me and he said, I've got something you've got to watch. He said, "Have you ever heard a knock at midnight?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." I see some of you nodding your heads. So I immediately got on YouTube and watched Dr. Martin Luther King's sermon, "A Knock at Midnight." I encourage all of you to go and listen to that sermon, or just read the transcript. I did both. I listened to it first, and then went back and read the transcript. And the imagery there is, of course, the parable about coming to the door, knocking on the door, and it's midnight. And it's midnight in America right now, right? Morally, it's midnight. Lots of things that were going on in 1968, which actually was the year I was born. You know, that's the year the United Methodist Church became the United Methodist Church. So I'm that United Methodist who's had only a United Methodist experience. But come at the door, knock, 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 and the person inside is complacent. They're asleep. Children are asleep, don't really want to get up, don't want to answer the door. And so I just thought that imagery was so powerful for if the church is on the inside and we're hearing this knock of racism, and what is it? Why is it? I'm 55 years old, and all the work we've done through Courageous Conversations, it's you get very frustrated, right? Because it just seems like, oh my gosh, why is this taking so long? Well, think about our black brothers and sisters. I mean, seriously, if I'm impatient starting these conversations and beginning to learn this history in 2015, imagine how those who've been experiencing this their entire lifetimes must be. So my question to you, and then I hope you all are thinking about your questions, is when you say you feel like there's more that we can do. We've got the bread of faith, we've got the bread of love, we've got the bread of hope inside, the knock is at the door. Of the things that you mentioned, is there something that you think could make a really big difference in bringing about systemic change, and maybe in a faster fashion than we have seen these last many decades?
Wow, what a question. Thanks, Georgianne. Yeah, thanks for listening so carefully. It got really quiet in here. That's interesting. I wonder what that's about. So I don't think that there's anything that replaces doing the work than doing the work. And I think that what we've been unwilling to do as white American Methodists is really do the work. I mean, there's a group in here, we're doing the work, right? But look around. You're probably the youngest. You may be the youngest person in here, right? Yeah. So, my hope for the book. I mean, my basic thing is I want people to know this history and to respond to it in some way, okay, and to allow this history to soak in and maybe to cause some transformative changes in the life of the church once they've read this and understand it. So that's one thing. When I say that I think there's more to do in the church, what I mean by that is that I don't think that a lot of the anti-racism work has connected with most local congregations. And I don't know what all of the leavings of the churches, I'm not sure what that means as far as the future. I'm not sure that if the churches are staying, does that mean that they're in favor of anti-racism? I mean, they're not all signing up to be part of the RMN, right? The folks who are staying. So I'm not sure where they are. But I think that to me so learn the history and try to find ways to incorporate that into your church's life. Maybe sometime during the year you have services that relate to Black History Month or something like that. Talk about the real history of what happened in this conference and in this area. Our church, University United Methodist Church, so we could say, well, with Dr. Heinsohn, we were pushing back against segregation already in the 50s and 60s, and we were doing all these great things. But that's not really true. That's not really the history of the church. That was a small group of people, right? And University Church was founded in 1887. There were 2 Methodist churches at that time. Guess what we were? We were MEC South, right? We became part of a church that thought just a generation before that it was okay to enslave people. And so that's part of our history. And I think it's a part of our history that we don't even think about. We just sort of gloss over it like, that was a long time ago and didn't really mean anything. But I wonder if they had an opportunity. I don't know what life was like back then, if they said, well, do you want to be a northern church or a southern church? I don't know if that was a realistic possibility or not. The other thing I'll say in response to that question is that I think it's important to follow the example of people like Ed King and then people like the Methodist women and take our cues from groups of people of color that are organizing in our communities. And so our racial justice group, we have folks that are in the group that are members of the Austin Justice Coalition. And so when we do our work or think about what we're going to do for the next year, we take the cue from what they're doing. We don't make up stuff out of our heads about what we think might be a good idea or something. So one of the things they want to work on is poverty, because they're interested in the fact that more and more these issues intersect, right? And so poverty is, sure, it's bad for white people who are in poverty, but it's doubly and triply bad for people of color. And so that's going to be an emphasis. And that doesn't really answer your question, you know.
It's a very good start. All right, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk around. If you'll hold up your hands, I'm going to give you the mic so that you can be heard by everyone.
John, you know, merger, which was the destruction of the Central Conference, was a long time ago, early 1975, around there. And the hope was then that you would have integration within the individual congregations. What do you think has happened in the last, almost 50 years, that has not come about? That, you know, Methodist churches and other churches are still among the whitest places you find in the country on Sunday mornings. What are the forces that have held that back, in your opinion?
Yeah.
And what could change that?
So in 1968, we made this big move to end the central jurisdiction, that was the jurisdiction where we had in 1939 said, okay, we're going to bring the southern and northern churches back together, but all of the black Methodists are going to be in a central jurisdiction, and it's going to be connected, but it's going to be somewhat separate, right? And so that was supposed to end in 1968, and then all of these conferences overlapped. So the central jurisdiction overlapped all the south and parts of the north. So you had like 2 or 3 conferences in Alabama, right, or Mississippi, or Georgia, and the idea was for them to come together and to integrate. And it took almost 5 years for that to happen. And basically, I was out of South Carolina, or one of the conferences almost had to be integrated almost like at gunpoint. You know, I mean, not literally. I don't think the bishop would have brought in a gun, but he might have wanted to with some of the recalcitrants in that conference. 5 years it took, right? And I think the answer is simple. I mean, I think it was just simply racism and white supremacy, that people they had grown up with these ideas, and they just could not move beyond those ideas to embrace what the gospel was inviting them to do. And it's that this is a battle that all of us have, right? Where the culture is pushing us. We have these cultural ideals and values and things that we hold on to. And at the same time, we have the gospel that says this. Now, Bill, you're a very kind person, so I'm not going to direct this comment directly to you. and you also were kind enough to write this book, which I had to lift up. Do you all know Bill's book, Go and Be Reconciled? Fascinating book about Alabama Methodists, basically over a 20-year period during this time that you're talking about. So I sometimes wonder what Methodists will be talking about 50 or 60 years from now. How will they look at us, and what will they say? What will be our strong points? What will be our weaknesses? And I wonder if they'll look at us and say, how could Methodists back in 2023 have a meeting about climate change and then get in their cars and all drive individually to their houses? How could they do that? So, if you think about, the system of slavery, for at least some churches, you could not be a person who enslaved persons and somebody in the church. In other words, you could not participate and be a part of the main economy at that time and be a member and be a Quaker, for example, right? But we can be participants in an economy that hurts people, and we can still be members of them. So there's always these contradictions, right? They're always there. But I would say that's the basic thing is our cultural values and then the values of the gospel. And they come in conflict. And which way do we often go? We go back and hide under our cultural values. I think there's a difference between anti-racism work and creating multi-ethnic churches. And I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking, but I think when we look at the church today, we see it segregated. I don't know how many people, when I was pastor at University Church, would say, well, I'd like to be part of a progressive church, but I mean, what's the deal? You all are all a bunch of white people. How come you don't have any black or brown people in the church? You say the doors are open and all of that. Well, I think there's a lot of cultural reasons why those kinds of things aren't happening. But I'm not sure that trying to create multi-ethnic churches is anti-racism work. I think what we need to do in our white churches and our white communities is we need to do the anti-racism work. And then, if out of that, churches become more ethnically diverse, amen and hallelujah, right? But to try to create this ahead of time where we haven't done the work, what is that group where there's like, it's a kind of anti-racism, One World. They bring together usually about a third white, a third black, and then a third brown and other folks, right? And you have an all-day conference, and you meet in groups. And I was meeting in a group with another black woman, and she said, somebody asked her and said, how would you feel about like white people coming to your church, or how come you don't go to just go to a white church and just help integrate the church? And she said, I have to put up with white people all day long, all week long at my job.
Yeah.
All week long. I have to put up with all their stuff. We would call those things microaggressions today, right? All the things, touching the hair, whatever it is, where were you born? No, where are your people from? No, where are they really, all that nonsense. I have to put up with that all week long. I do not want to have to deal with that on Sunday morning when I'm in worship. And it's like, so we have work to do because we're not safe. Our congregations are not safe places in many cases for black and brown people to be in worship, in teaching, and fellowship with us until we do that work. Okay,
Amen.
Off my high horse.
Great question. Thank you. Who else
Thanks,
has a
Bill.
question? Beverly.
Just to follow up on what we
please.
just said, white churches or typical white Methodist church isn't a safe place for white people to speak up around racial issues very often. And so how can that work begin when the divisiveness is so profound because of the emotional, cultural, economic, everything work that people have to do?
Yeah, it's one of the things that I talk about in the book, and it's not an original idea, is that racism and white supremacy pop up in different ways at different times, right? So before 1860 in our country, it was mostly popped up as segregation and enslavement. And then after 1860, it was segregation. It turned into Jim Crow. And so one of the questions that I had was, what shape does racism take today? Because most people, when you ask them if they're racist, they'll say no, right? And yet Robbie Jones has done studies of evangelicals and mainline churches and finds that we swing way over on the anti-racism index toward racism in our churches. So it is. So it's difficult to have these conversations. I think one of the areas that I would really like to see some work done on is this whole idea of colorblindness that I talk about in the toward the end of the book. And I'm not sure how much that would help. But colorblindness is basically it's a group of ideas. It's the idea that we're post-racial, right? The civil rights era, racism is over. And it's also most often expressed as, I don't see color. So we would have people come into the anti-racist group at University Church, and Kathy, you probably remember this, and they would sit there and say, well, I don't see color. And yet what people of color tell us over and over again is, if you don't see color, if you don't see my color, then you do not see me. So color blindness is, I think, it's a form of racism. It's a form that it's taken. It's maybe not as active and as ugly as some forms, but it is, because it allows everything just stays the same, right? We've worked on racism. We're done with it. We're all not seeing color. We needed to stop talking about it, because if you talk about it, it just stirs things up, right? You all have heard all these things. I would love to hear answers to your question, because I honestly don't know how to do that work in churches where there's resistance to it. I mean, my feeling has always been, I try to work with the people that God puts in front of me and work with folks where I find some interest and all of that. But I do not know, especially in this divided times, how you're going to convince people. What I hope maybe also is in the church today, is it possible that we might be maybe part of a small group of folks who would identify as anti-racists, and then there'd be another group that would identify as people who are maybe more infected with racist ideas than we are. We all carry racist ideas in us, right? And we all have to fight those all the time. And then there's a middle group that maybe might want to do something but's not doing anything. Which group should we work with? I mean, we're in this smaller group, maybe here mostly, right? And there's that other group that they don't want to hear anything that we're saying. But there's maybe that whole middle group, and who are they and where are they? And is there some way that we can work with some of those folks who are just disengaged from it? I don't know. What do y'all think?
They're not in the church.
They may not be in the church, right? And so we may have to go in the community and actually, you mean, Nettie, are you saying we might have to get out of the church to do the work?
Sounds like a great question to take up.
Yeah.
I love this question, and as a longtime member of the Micah workers over at First United Methodist, we grapple with this. So recently, Robin DeAngelo did a video conference in Seattle, and I was able to sit in on it. And they asked her the question at the end, now what's the important work that we can do really to put an end to this? And she said, humbling me a great deal, she said, if you have to ask the question, I have to say, look in the mirror at your white privilege, because it's everywhere. You go online, you can Google, anti-racist activities. You can Google, put an end to racism. And she said the resources would be more than you can handle in a lifetime. Yeah. And so that we don't know is part of the isolation that I've created for myself. Mm-hmm. But she said, I will give one, and then her black co-presenter said, well, I will give one idea, and you should listen carefully to this. Join your local NAACP. Because if you want to know what black people want and need, mm-hmm. guess what? Ask the black people, mm-hmm. and they're not shy about telling you. Mm-hmm. And so that's on my next list of actions. Plus, our group started out by teaching the class and reteaching the class and modifying the class, and we've reached about 100 members of our church and community mm-hmm. over the last 3 years, and that feels good. But this year, we're really diversifying. We're showing movies. We're trying to have conversations with parents about books that their kids can read. We're trying to have book discussions. We're having book groups, and we're just trying to diversify so that there might be something mm-hmm. to interest somebody in that middle group, and maybe even someone on the outside group. And one person at a time, we can become and we can make the beloved community. We have to believe that. We are the beloved community, and I follow Pastor Ron's mission, which is to see people that are far from us as not yet friends, mm-hmm. and to have a real curiosity about how they got to that place in their history and in the way that we've taught them, mm-hmm. and have that curiosity and that invitation to the Holy Spirit. We are the voice and we are the difference. And I'm so grateful. I mean, I see these faces, and I think, whoa, we're a powerhouse, and we've got God on our side.
Beautiful answer. Thank you so much.
I'm going to do Bernie, and then I'm coming back to Crystal.
At some point, all of us were not involved in this work, right? Yeah, and somehow we got into this work. So the fact that all of us are here in a way is kind of miraculous in a way, right? Bernie?
Hello, John.
Hello, Bernie.
This is my senior pastor.
Bernie was
on
my
his
district
staff for 8 years.
Bernie was
in Austin.
Go ahead, Bernie.
And I don't want any of this to sound like I'm contradicting anything that you said, because I have never in my life contradicted you. Never. And I'm not going to start today. You just need to know that starting in July the 1st, I've been the interim pastor at Elgin, Texas, working with a group of 45 United Methodists. 60% of their congregation divorced them. I'm working with the remnant who want to be United Methodists. Somewhere along the line, years ago, They got the message about the kind of inclusiveness that you're talking about. Because on the second Sunday I was there, in the second Sunday of July, I noticed in the congregation there were 40 people attending. There were 2 African American families there. Then as the service started, there were 10 Spanish-speaking people from one United family who came in the door and wanted to worship with us. I found out later that the reason for that is that someone in that church, one of the white United Methodists, had reached out to that family because they had had a house fire that destroyed one of their homes that week. They wanted to come to the United Methodist Church to say thank you. We gathered around the altar and offered a prayer for them. They have not been back. That's all right. The black families are always there. One of the black teenagers is an acolyte. Somewhere in the past, I didn't do it. This all happened before I got there, but these are very creative people who want to be United Methodists, and they have been divorced. But you know how painful that is? I keep thinking in a small town, when this split that has happened within our congregations happens, it's very painful for people who live in a small town. Maybe it'd be painful if you live in a city. I don't know for sure. But I think if you went to school with these people, if you were in business with them, if some of them are related to you, it's very painful. But I'm just witnessing. That's Exhibit A. That's all I have.
Praise God for the members of your church who answered the knock at the door.
Thanks, Bernie.
Thank you. Good evening. I think that I tend to wear rose-colored glasses. During the middle of the pandemic, when we should have been isolating ourselves, and those marches came about, Black Lives Matter, y'all remember those? Mm-hmm. And we saw primarily young people of every race and persuasion that we could see. And that is my hope. And so what I think we need to do as a church, knowing that the generation behind us and behind them is basically unchurched, is to reach them. I think we've seen there's evidence of people wanting to embrace, perhaps beyond what they were taught, but are ready and are doing this work. Thank you.
Other questions? Lots to think about, right? You want to make one more comment or a question?
Tiny question. What is included in our convocation and, for the young people who are joining the church, what is included for them on, these racial issues?
I know what you are. Confirmation classes. Oh, for confirmation? Nothing. Nothing.
Well, that'd be a starting place.
Might be, right? Put something into the confirmation materials about that. Well, history gets a bad rap sometimes, doesn't it? Oh, it's boring. It's all that old stuff happened a long time ago. Hard to keep the attention of, middle schoolers. But yeah, it absolutely should be. It should be in our Methodist books. Yeah. Somebody over here had a question.
That just raised a question. How much of this is in our seminaries?
Well, more and more it's in our seminaries. So I did a presentation at University Church, and David White was there, just retired from APTS, and he said that all of the, and Jessica, you can probably speak a little bit more to this, but all of the seminary classes have to have these kinds of goals and values in mind in the classroom. When our son teaches at Hamilton College up in New York State, and so he has to have purposes and things that are going to relate to the DEI vision of the college. So you're more recent from seminary than I am. When I went to seminary, there was nothing.
So I started seminary 15 years ago, like last month. And at Duke then, which Duke is a different context than we're in Texas, but there was a lot of this in our seminary education. We had specific classes on the Black church, on racial issues and all kinds of things. So, but we had Willie Jennings, so, there was that. Yeah, so that was a big part of my seminary education, and I think it's more and more everywhere.
That's right. Yeah, what happens in seminary stays in seminary, It's like Vegas, I tell you.
So I was going to ask you.
Not that I know anything about Vegas.
I was going to ask you one more question to wrap it up, but it's another big question, and you may not know. So this past week, I read an old Parker Palmer post where he referenced a Mary Oliver poem about what do I need to let go of. And I want to thank you for being a white male and taking this up as you retired from the local church. So Parker Palmer's question was, what are you going to give yourself to next?
Well, I didn't realize that when you write a book, Bill, you know this, when you write a book, and you're not it's not with Random House, okay? The job of getting the book out to the public is on you. So I've been spending all of my time right now. You know what I'm doing is I'm writing emails I have the RMN list of all of the RMN churches. So I'm going through church by church. I'm on California. Do you know how many RMN churches there are in California? Oh my gosh, and so I have like 450 emails that I've sent out to staff. I don't know if they're ending up in their junk mail. So I'm trying to get the word out to them. I don't have plans right now to pursue any other justice thing. What I'm doing is I did so many justice things when I was a pastor that I just felt like I was pulled in too many different directions. And so I'm wanting really to focus on this racial justice work and really and really do work not only in our church, but in the congregation, but also in the community. So, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I hope you'll think about how we can help you with that. Thank you all very much. Let's give a hand to Reverend John Elford. Thank you so very, very much. We appreciate it. And we have refreshments. Hope we encourage you to visit. Dr. Swain has
the books go? Over here.
Book signing.
Are you serious? I am serious.
We ordered ours online.
Well,
It's also on Kindle also.
you can get it on Kindle. I don't like Amazon, so I go to like bookshop.org, or I order from what's the name of the one in Austin that's up in the north side? It's like Black Mama's bookstore or something like that. Black Pearl. Book People also, an independent bookstore. Yeah, that's what I tend to do.
We have one here called Lark and Al.
And Lark and Al, even if they don't have it in stock, they'll order it for you, so you're still benefiting them.
Thank you all for buying all the books. I brought 15 books. So.
Thank you, Georgianne. Thank you, John. I look forward to talking with you in a minute. Thank you, Jeff, Jessica. I just left a meeting before coming here this afternoon, and you're getting a preview of something to come where you can participate and begin this work that you're talking about. On November the 19th, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, there will be a gathering, an interfaith and community gathering at the courthouse to move the monument. We have sat around and we've let this monument, this statue, divide our community. We have gathered as leaders of faith communities and as community members to say it's got to go. One of the last request that George Brightwell made of us in Courageous Conversations is to move the monument. November the 19th, 2 o'clock at the courthouse. Let's meet there and let our county commissioners know that it's time for that monument to go. And I'm not a poet, and I know it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. All right. You're invited to come enjoy some refreshments and conversations with one another. Thank you. Oh, thank you. That was great. It's very